One of the types of discomfort with testing that's super important to talk about is the emotional discomfort, the stress and duress and the fear that can get connected to testing for STIs and knowing an STI status. And the source of those types of fears are rooted in sex shame, STI stigma, and just health shame in general. Sex shame, like everything else, is intersectional. It means that different aspects of our identity are going to impact the way that we experience sex shame, with sex shame being both external and internalized negative emotions, anxiety, guilt around different types of sexual activity. And as that translates into what that means about you as a person. Sex shame can be something that we do to ourselves, and it can be something that we do to others by being judgmental of different types of sex they have or their reasons for having sex. Discussing sex shame can be a whole other video itself. I'm going to link some articles and videos and other sources of information that talk about sex shame more in depth. Given that definition, I'm sure it's easy to understand the connection between sex shame and then STI stigma. Stigma being negative attitudes, beliefs, thought systems about specifically sexually transmitted infections. Super often, the stigma or the negative emotional association with a sexually transmitted infection is what actually has the greater impact on a person's life than the infection themselves, particularly in a place where access to medication is easier, and we're not talking about things that are life-threatening. STIs are a risk when you are sexually active, but risk is part of life. We're always negotiating risks. There are choices we can make to help take care of our physical health and the physical health of our partners as best we can. And it's equally important that we do the work to take care of our emotional health and the emotional health of partners. Things like unpacking internalized STI stigma and sex shame. It can be so helpful to check in with yourself about what it is that you start to feel when you think about having a positive STI result or having a positive STI status, especially when it comes to something that isn't curable like herpes or HIV. And to always remember that, yeah, sure, anything that affects our health is going to be undesirable. But all sorts of things affect our health all the time. We get colds, we get flus, we get cancer. And when that happens, it's not that there isn't other types of health shame, which I'll talk about in one sec, but we don't vilify or make less than the person who is ill. Whether we're talking about folks with terminal illness or chronic pain or living with disabilities, physical or otherwise, when we treat health as a moral issue, as if we can assign value or judgment to people based on their health status, what we're doing is we're erasing the realities for the majority of the human experience. When we talk about health shame, what we're talking about is that we live in a culture that puts good health on a pedestal, and there are these criteria for what good health is. But what happens when we do that is we really discount and erase the lived experiences of probably most people. And sometimes those criteria come out to be like really arbitrary, like the BMI, for example. Health can't be thought of as this umbrella. There's all different types of ways that we can be healthy or unhealthy. I mean, ideally we're healthy and nothing impacts us in our entire lives, but that's just not a realistic expectation for what it is to be a human being that is moving through the world with other human beings. So as we move through the world as human beings with other human beings, Let's try and practice empathy. Let's try and practice seeing others as whole and not judging them based on a health status or not assigning value or lesser value to others or ourselves if something happens, like we get chlamydia. A few final considerations. Language, language, language. Language matters. When we're trying to dismantle STI stigma, the language we use to talk about STIs, to talk about positive STI status, and the ways we talk to partners negotiating safer sex methods, which keep doing it, love to see it. The language we use when we're doing it can have an impact on somebody's ability or willingness to show up to that conversation. Language like I'm clean or saying someone's dirty because they have an STI is just harmful and ineffective. So some of the ways you can talk about STI status with partners, whether that's in real time, like you're about to get down, you're about to exchange fluids and you're like, hey, before we get into all of that, I was tested recently and I'm negative for STIs. Or if you aren't negative for STIs, you can say, I've been tested recently. I do have genital warts. I'm not having an outbreak right now. I can tell you more about it, but I feel comfortable with this type of, and that person can make an informed decision about the types of sex they have with you. I find that by offering up your status, it invites the other person to offer theirs. So you can be like, how about you? And all of a sudden, the weight of the conversation can be a lot more chill because you're like in it together. And if someone's like, well, actually, yeah, like I have herpes, and you can ask them, well, what does that look like for you? And keep asking questions until you arrive at a decision about what safer sex looks like for you in those moments. Also, talk to people about your other health stuff too. Be like, you know what? I got a cold right now. Are you like okay with getting a cold if we make out? Something else you can do if someone discloses a positive status to you is to thank them for being honest with you. Thank you for being honest with me. I feel like we can make a decision that we're both comfortable with. Or you might be like, you know what? No judgment, but for me, for my health, I am not sure I want to take that risk right now. Let me learn a little bit about it and we can revisit this. How about we do something else? Or maybe you shut it down and rejection is part of sex. It sucks, but risk, rejection, all of that is part of sex and all of that is part of life. I wish it wasn't. It would be nice if people said yes to me all the time. I am a quintuple fire sign. But that's just not how it goes. Another consideration is that we don't always know where an STI, came from. If we're sexually active, especially if we've been sexually active with multiple people over our lifetime, sometimes something doesn't show up till a little later. So even if you've hooked up with someone recently and you test positive for an STI after that, I'm thinking most specifically things like genital warts and herpes, don't necessarily call that person up and be like, you gave me herpes. You call them up and say, hey, so we recently, I just tested positive for blank. You might want to go get tested. You can apologize if you want to. I mean, like I would apologize to someone if I knew that I gave them the flu or if I thought I gave them the flu. But try not to take on the burden of too much responsibility because part of consensual sex and consent culture is having these types of discussions as well as educating yourself about the different types of risks associated with the different types of sex that you like to have, particularly with others. By watching this video, you are participating in consent culture. Thank you. That's it for this episode of Sexy Sexual Health Education. I hope you remember that practicing safer sex is a practice. Having these conversations can be uncomfortable or awkward, but like lots of stuff is awkward. Like this outro. See you next time.